We are going to follow the money.
Everything you need to know can be understood with this simple phrase: follow the money. And believe me, that's what's happening.
Here comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money.
Welcome to College Sports Follow the Money, an all-new podcast diving into the critical issues surrounding the big business of college sports. I'm Andrew Monaco, joined by former president of Texas A&M University and former chancellor at the University of Missouri, Dr. Bowen Loftin, and former vice president and general manager of Fox Sports Southwest, Jon Heidtke. From NIL to the transfer portal and opt-outs, to the college football playoff, conference realignment, and more, we tackle the key issues facing college athletics today and into the future.
I need to feel you, Jerry! Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money! Show me the money! You love this black man!
We welcome you inside for another episode 64, College Sports Follow the Money, collegesportsftm@gmail.com. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Dr. Bowen Loftin, Jon Heidtke, we are pleased to have as our guest on this episode, Travis Brown, KBTX, senior Texas A&M sportswriter, baseball legend, all-around good guy. You have read him. Now you get a chance to see him. And I'm Andrew Monaco. We're glad you're with us. Let's go around. Dr. Loftin, howdy, my friend.
Howdy, guys. I'm just back from, of course, Alaska. The last one of these I recorded was I was in Alaska. High temperatures were 52 to 55 degrees every day. So I walked off the plane in Houston and ran into a brick wall of humidity and heat. It was quite a shock to my system. So anyway, I'm back breathing this nice 103-degree weather today. Right, Jon?
Can't beat it. It's good for sinuses.
Jon, I don't know if your schedule gets busier now that classes have started or if it's a chance because you were busy this summer, that's for sure.
Well, I'm a little busier now with class starting, but hopefully we'll be able to manage it all here. But looking forward to having you gentlemen come back and to be a guest lecturers here. All the students always learn from the knowledge that you can drop on them.
Anytime, and I hope they still continue in the major, that's for sure. Travis is our little helper. Inside joke there, Travis, for this episode. Travis, we're going to talk about NIL, and I'm going to intro this very tongue-in-cheek because you have gone, it's a much deeper dive. Travis, all we had before was sliced bread throwing $30 million out, and everybody accepted that. You took that deeper dive. Can you tell us more about what you've learned?
Yeah, sure. So I filed an open records request with A&M. It's something I've done the past 3 years since NIL, of course, came into being in July 1 of 2021, and just tried to get an idea of what some of these numbers are. To give a little context, according to the state law that makes NIL legal in Texas, when a student athlete enters into an NIL deal, they have to put it together a contract, and that contract has to be submitted to the athletic department for it to be reviewed, not for if it's a good deal or not, but to make sure that it follows certain pieces of the Texas law. There's a few kind of vice industries that can't be that student athletes can't represent. They need to work out a deal with the university to be able to use the university's marks and such. So just following the state law that gets looked at over at A&M, and those contracts then go on file in A&M. Well, because they're on file at A&M, you can file, at least a little more complicated than that, but because they're on file, you can file an open records request for some of those numbers. So in the first year that A&M had NIL, the total number of NIL deals that were done with A&M athletes was $3,073,118. For men, that made men's sports made up 2.9, really almost all of that. It was 2.972 million of that. Only 100,000 of that went to the women. So again, next year, filed another open records request, got the same numbers. That total number went up just over $3 million to $6.179 million for total athletes. But again, with the men, that's 6.024 million for the men and 154,000 for the women. Things really ratcheted up in this last year. And I'll add a caveat. In the first season, what I kind of, to get into the weeds more about what I said about it being a little bit more complicated, between in 2023, there was a new NIL law that was passed in the state legislature that gave the schools in Texas a little bit more leeway in helping negotiate some of these deals. It made it easier for them to student athletes to wear A&M branding or do something in Kyle Field as a part of some of these commercials and deals. But it also made most of this NIL data not open to public record. So in the first year, I was able to get breakdowns by sport, but in the last 2 years, they've only been able to give me, because of the law, the total numbers, and then it divided by men's and women's sports. And that's mostly because of the precedent set by the first year that's what they were able to give me as well. But that being said, in the last year, total, it went from 6.79 million to 19.5 million in a year turnaround. 18.9 million of that went to the men's sports, and women's sports did see a bump to $528,000 of that making the NIL money, but that still only makes up 3% of the total NIL revenue from college sports. So that's kind of the 30,000-foot view of what I was able to get. But it does give a little bit more of a peek into what the market value kind of is in a total scale for NIL deals, and that if you want to hear or talk about, at least from an A&M perspective, donor fatigue or people not liking it, well, NIL has made strides at A&M especially in year 3.
Dr. Loftin, you've been a big one in this, and we've gone through iterations, as Travis was talking about. It started because the NCAA was hands off. States jumped in. I love what Travis said. When it first started, NIL, there was no school affiliation. You could not use school logos, represent anything. Now that we've gone on, there is now, you can work with maybe the apparel company. You can't go to an opposing apparel company, but you can work with some of the sponsors, donors, and partners for all of this. We talked earlier about how it's a Wild West, right? It was a Wild West when it first came out. Now we're starting to see a little more focus through all of this, aren't we?
We are, Andrew. The challenge, I think, still is, as Travis pointed out, there's a huge gap, at least in Texas A&M, between men's and women's sports. And I think it's even finer than that. Going back to your first year, Travis, you could probably look at how much of it went to football versus how much it went to everything else for the men. And then maybe men's basketball began to get a piece of that. Now we have a little bit of money trickling in on baseball as well. But I would say, my guess is it's still much of it is going to football. And that just reflects a real focus here. JT Higgins joined the family here at A&M a while back. Again, he was a longtime golf coach here, but then came back again to run Texas Aggies United. And my sense is, I see him talking to people all the time, and my sense is it's about football still largely. Is that your sense too, Travis?
Yes, football, A&M, just about any place that is a football first school, that is that is usually the focus of the NIL, or really the NIL donations. I something I actually would pose to y'all a little bit as some of the experts too in this conversation is, it's that same kind of conversation or question around the WNBA about equal pay versus what the market is willing to pay. And I'm curious to see how NIL is going to follow suit with that. If there is going to be more of a push for women's sports across the country in some of this NIL payments and NIL compensation, kind of with the resurgence or the emergence that the WNBA has been having this year in value and attention, or if it's going to be something that the market will always continue to dictate where the money goes in this and the sports. Because I know there was a lot of questions veering over into a whole nother subject, and that is the House versus the NCAA settlement that's going to get into revenue sharing. When it looked at the Title IX questions that's going to be a part of that, people were curious to see how they were going to necessarily divide up that money. Were they going to do it more equally between men's and women's sports, or were they going to kind of follow the actual revenue numbers? And it seemed like everything else might follow that lead after that. And when the settlement did get released, football and men's basketball are getting the majority of that revenue money, and women's sports and other sports are getting a much smaller piece. Curious for y'all too. Do you think this is an instance that forever and always it's going to just follow the revenue, or do you think there will be some pay equity pushes in this field as well?
Well, let's make a distinction here between the past and the future. Judge Wilkin has in front of her a settlement agreement between the NCAA and the House plaintiffs. But there's two pieces of that. One part is looking at the past, going back to 2016. And that's where you're talking about the bulk of the money going to football and men's basketball. That's certainly in that settlement. But there is nothing in that settlement I've seen so far that specifically talks about the future and the payments to athletes from current revenues from to athletic departments. I think that offers a lot of opportunity for good or bad. It depends on how it works out. Title IX was ignored in the settlement completely. Judge Wilkins said she won't get into that at all. So that's an unresolved, litigable kind of problem. So there'll be litigation, I'm sure, about that going forward. So my hope is this that the conferences, especially the SEC and the Big Ten, who dominate everything, obviously, that they will, within their conference structure, decide on how to make the allocation by sport of the future revenue coming out of this beginning in 2025. That's my hope. If it goes the way, basically the settlement says the schools will determine what they will pay. Well, if every school has their own thing, boy, it's going to be even more chaotic than ever. And it makes it so difficult in terms of working through the process of recruiting and retention of a student athlete. So my hope is that we'll have cooler heads prevailing here, wiser heads prevailing. And at least the two major conferences will decide that we have to do something conference-wide. And that could define everything. Once that happens at the Big Ten and SEC level, that could flow down to the other, I guess, two Power 5 conferences or Power 4 conferences now, and eventually to the Group of 5 and so on down that ladder. That would bring some degree of order to this chaos and begin to hopefully look at this in a very equitable way, which might balance, Travis, to your point, the issue of revenue to the issue of equity. If everyone gets the same thing, I can just see the squawks about that, since about 85% of the revenue in college sports goes to one sport, football. That's where you make your money, okay? And that money has been used historically to fund the non-revenue sports. So if you're lucky in a given university, you have money from college football, you have some money from men's basketball, all depending on the tournament shares you get. And in a few places, baseball actually makes a little money, not much, but a little bit of money. Nothing else even breaks even. And so that situation offers itself as a problem for us. If you'd have that revenue coming from only a couple of places, how can you possibly share it equitably? So I think there has to be a compromise here, some recognition the revenue is out there that needs to be allocated to these non-revenue sports, so-called. And it'll hopefully get to a point where people feel comfortable, if you will, about that. Now, the kicker here for you, Travis, to react to is that certain schools have gone after certain sports with NIL money. Case in point, Oklahoma with softball. One person seems to be the person stepping up for that. I see evidence that Nebraska is doing the same thing with volleyball. So that's out there as a wild card. And of course, the settlement recognizes that NIL is there, and most people expect NIL to make up maybe at least almost as much as the revenue sharing makes up. So if you're talking 20, 21 million a year of revenue sharing at the Power 5 level, Power 4 level, potentially you have perhaps 12 to 20 million of NIL money looking at the numbers that are out there that you can see. And so that gives the ability for something to be looked at as well as for NIL going to certain athletes, certain sports, and providing some degree of elasticity to the calculations about how much revenue sharing is going on. But I appreciate your comments about NIL from the standpoint of certain sports being focused on by certain schools and using NIL to differentiate them from everybody else.
Right, right. And I think to your point too, it's been interesting to see. Thank you for clarifying the past versus the future piece of that. I think a lot of people are looking towards the past version of that, the money that's going back to athletes who didn't get NIL opportunities and how that's divided, to see what the value is of each individual sport. Because I mean, I think there is the revenue numbers and the financial models that come out for the NCAA each year, but when that is put so publicly in front of everybody, it kind of presents a market value for NIL donations, even going into those sports. What is this sport worth? What is the percentage of my NIL dollars that should go to these sports or these athletes? And I think that that's going to be interesting to see if it follows that trend, or if, like you're saying, there are certain teams in certain places that do get elevated above maybe what the national average says that sport is worth. For instance, the Oklahoma softball, the Nebraska volleyball, to see if other teams can kind of follow that model, other programs, excuse me, other schools can follow that model, elevate the presence of those, and therefore the NIL dollars follow. It's going to be interesting. Basically, it's going to be interesting to see how NIL changes, adapts, meshes with revenue sharing when that comes in, and what is the future of NIL? Because I think that there is a good chance that these numbers, the year 1, 2, 3 numbers, could look vastly different in year 5, is what it would be if the House settlement gets approved and that revenue sharing gets in place. What is NIL's role in that, and what do those numbers look like when some of the players are getting revenue, and what does that distribution look like amongst different sports, especially those beyond football?
Schools as brands, how it affects all of this. You can have brands within brands. Travis brought up those sports. Dr. Loftin brought up those sports. Dawn Staley at South Carolina, some hockey teams, college hockey, Wisconsin, Minnesota, men's, women's hockey for that. It can come down to branding, can it not?
It certainly can. And I think, again, that brand is going to be important. I think we're going to see something from A&M in Texas here in the next day or two about a new branding relationship that they have when they bring back the Lone Star Showdown. I think, again, that's a way to generate significant revenue. That's a $7-figure deal probably on an annual basis. So I think, again, as the schools look to raise revenue, those brands are going to be important on how they align with the university, because I'm not sure A&M will do it, but they're going to be schools you've already seen. They're going to put logos on their field. I think it's not going to be too long before you're going to see jersey patches, in terms of men's and women, or at least football and basketball, probably baseball too. So I think those opportunities are going to happen, which is going to grow revenue. So I think what's happening now is this is going to accelerate all of those types of conversations. And I think, again, as Dr. Loftin pointed out, I don't know if that's going to be an NCAA mandate, but it probably would be more at a conference level on how they look to handle those opportunities to raise revenue. And I think one of the conferences you're going to see be very aggressive in that is our friends at the Big 12, because Commissioner Yormark is looking for all kinds of ways to grow their revenue for their schools to help get them. I mean, he's talked private equity. He's talked he'll be the one that's probably pushing the envelope or the limits on this to see what they can do. And there'll be opportunities out there for that as well. So I think this is just going to be the first of many steps. Again, okay, we now know there's a revenue issue that we've got to put into the budget. And how are these schools going to generate that? Well, but revenue, if there's not, again, from a donor fatigue standpoint, you're television deals are kind of locked in for a little while now. So it's going to be some of these creative ideas here that, again, have significant revenue opportunities attached to them. So we'll see how quickly those things roll into the college athletic world as well.
So we continue from the Pitbull Studios with this podcast, right? Did anybody else find it slightly odd? I'm not going to say tone deaf, that Mike Gundy at Oklahoma State says, quit asking for money. And then a couple of days later, there's a QR code on the back of the Cowboys helmets that you
funny about that. Both sides of your mouth here situation. I mean, money is still the driver. That's why we are following the money in this particular podcast. Money is still a huge driver here and will be. Back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, NIL is sort of supposed to be a sweetener on top of this revenue sharing model that's coming out of the House settlement. Okay, well, that sounds good, except you realize that there's still a plethora of state laws about NIL. So if you have a conference which spans multiple states, which they all do by and large, how do you really generate a model that is truly going to work when NIL deals in one state are handled one way and they're handled a different way in another state in the same conference? That's a problem. And so again, lacking the national standard here for this, we have a difficulty. I don't see the NCAA being able to pull this together and make something work. So either we have a national law at some point, or somehow the conferences again figure it out, in spite of different state laws, how to be able to manage this. NIL may be the most difficult problem, more so than the revenue sharing, because there is this differential now potentially available to you between states, given how their laws are written and how much visibility the NIL has to have. In Texas, it's one thing. It's something else in Oklahoma, something else in Missouri, something else in Arkansas, and. So we run into these problems right away. And I just don't know who has the clout to be able to bring order out of this chaos again.
It reminds me of speed limits, how they differ from state to state.
Got to watch it when you cross the state line, sir. Texas has the highest in the country, 85 miles an hour on the tollways up around Austin there to Waco and so on. So when you cross that state line, in fact, driving here to Houston on Highway 6, I go from 70 to 75 to 65 to 60 to get into Houston. Okay, think about that. Yeah. That's just in one state. So we have to find a way to manage this well. I just don't know who has the position, the clout to be able to manage this. It's not a simple thing. The best shot, I believe, is the conferences. If they will get their act together, especially if the Big Ten and the SEC can even collaborate a bit without running afoul of antitrust laws anyway, it could be a major step forward. And those two conferences could set a standard for everybody else if they do it right. I will certainly speak to Commissioner Sankey about this when I have a chance, and we'll see what he says. But they've been pretty quiet about this so far. Both commissioners have been.
Now, I agree with Dr. Loftin. I think then if the conferences were to do that, the state laws may become silent on this topic anyways. So they've changed the rules pretty quick to adapt to it. They can probably change it back to just be silent to it.
Yeah, true enough.
Andrew, to your initial question, Twitter was awesome with that when that got dropped about the Oklahoma State helmets, because there's like people posting pictures of guys looking through sniper scopes. It'd be like me trying to scan the QR code on the helmets. I think someone made a black A&M helmet for the black uniforms that had a giant QR code on the side of it saying this is what A&M could do. So that was great. But yeah, to go to the state laws portion, that's going to be a big point of I would think with Texas coming into the next legislature next year, because with this settlement, it does loosen some of the NIL laws in the ability for schools to not only be even more involved with NIL deal making, but even potentially bringing NIL collectives in house. Both of the level to which schools can be involved that is equal to that in the settlement is not something that is allowed in the Texas state law currently. And the ability, if A&M or any of these schools wanted to bring their collective in-house, that also is not legal under the current law. I'm curious to see, and I've been reaching out to try to see if there is an appetite to amend or repeal coming up in this next legislative session.
Travis, a question for clarification is, when you were doing the NIL research, did that include collective revenue, or was that just NIL money that was generated through the A&M?
It was, to be clear, I don't know. It was, when I put in the verbiage of my open records request to the university, was the total number of NIL deals per the contracts that were submitted to the university for approval according to the state law. So I would assume that that would include deals done outside of the collective and deals done inside the collective, because all of those contracts have to be submitted to the university. But because of the transparency laws or transparency clauses put into the new NIL law, I don't get that differentiation. I just get the exact total numbers. Let me also clarify, going back to the first question, because I just forgot this really key part to that. And that is the data that they gave to me. And this is the only data they gave to me. They didn't differentiate this. The data given to me included the total sum of multi-year contracts that were signed in the year with which they were signed. So if player X signs a 3-year contract with the collective that's worth $200,000, the entirety of that contract is included in that year's number, but doesn't carry over to the next year. So there is a little caveat to those numbers in that it does include multi-year deals, but within the year that that deal was signed.
That makes it seems like it sounds low, what numbers they reported.
Well, I think it's a growing number here. The problem is, we have contracts expiring, contracts beginning, and until you can sort it out accurately, it's a problem. And again, Texas law makes it complicated to do that. Not so elsewhere. Some places there's no access. Some places there's a lot of access. So it varies a lot how much you really know. But I think Travis is correct. I think the collective contracts, they're still, from the collective issue, there's still individual contracts with individual players. So they have to be reported, as I understand the state law, to the university. So I think you had everything there, Travis. I believe you had it all. But now you mentioned the real problem is you can't sort it out by year because they're including the total sum in the year of signature. But that means that things fall off. So as we go forward in time, contracts fall off, contracts are added. So it'll probably equal out a little bit over time and give you a reasonable picture. But we're in a point of transition right now, which makes it really hard with a snapshot to get really a sense of the longevity of these things and how long these particular numbers are going to be persistent.
And that goes to the point, and this is, I will caveat this statement as this is my educated summation, not actual reporting, but with JT Higgins, with the more the unifying of the collective efforts at A&M, it does make sense too why some of those numbers might go up because of a more concerted effort to make multi-year deals, to have a little bit more of a collected collective in year 3. And that's where a little bit of that spike could come from. Again, I don't have the parsed out data, but that would certainly make sense.
To that point of, now we can have player with sponsor, do something for them. Now we can have this where, as we said, it was step by step. No, you can't use the team colors, can't use the school colors, can't use the school logo, can't use the school name. Oh, now we can't, like it seems like that increment has added to the increase in money as well.
Yeah, those processes are streamlined. Thus why you see a lot more of the player jerseys sold around where they have the players' names on them, and you have players, representing the school in their uniforms and things like that. And that is, it was always fascinating to me to hear about in year one and a little bit in year two, the efforts that went into when they sold the players' jerseys with their names on them, like at Kyle Field or whatever at that, because it was a contract with Adidas for the Adidas marks. It was a contract with the university for the university's marks, and it was a contract with the players for their names. The three separate contracts went into making that one jersey. And from the initial reports, there wasn't a huge percentage of that money that actually went back to the player because that process was so complicated and so many people were getting a piece of that pie for just that one basketball jersey, which was kind of wild. I know in talking back with men's basketball people back then, there wasn't actually that many A&M men's basketball players that opted in to the have your name on a jersey NIL deal because the process was too complicated and the all the paperwork that you had to sign wasn't worth the amount of money that you potentially get back from that.
And there's another issue here too, guys. The NIL contracts vary quite a bit, especially those that are not done within the collective itself, in terms of what value is transferred back to the athlete. For example, you may have seen a news article about the Georgia quarterback, Carson Beck. He signed a deal with a private jet company. Well, how do you value that, especially going forward? I mean, how many rides will he take? How long will they be? What will they cost? Those are very, very, those are variable numbers. I don't know how to value something like that unless there's a cap within the contract, which I haven't seen. So that's out there as well. I mean, Beck's kind of interesting. He's actually got a Lamborghini. He's a car buff. So he's got one of the more lucrative deals. But there are two other guys, at least, who have deals with private jet companies that allow them to travel free to themselves in return for their ability to have their NIL used by that company in their advertising and such. So that's out there as well. So valuing NIL deals is not always simple. It's not always just money being transferred back to the athlete. It could be goods and services, and those will vary somewhat in terms of the length of the contract. How do you take care of that? So I see lots of issues here to work through. This could take a lot of lawyers, a lot of time to be able to go through and come up with answers for it. But I want to explore one thing with you guys, which segues away from this a little bit here as we get towards the second half of our podcast here. And that's the deal we have with coaching and how coaches try to manage this right now. AP did a really interesting article a few days ago about this, where they interviewed several coaches, and they were focusing on the new coaches, those that are fairly new to the job of being a head coach in college football, and asking them about how things are changing right now. And I particularly latched on to Dillingham's comments. I mean, Coach Dillingham is, I think, the youngest coach in D1. Is that correct, guys? I think he is.
I don't know if he's the youngest currently. He was at one point. And
one time. So
yeah.
He's a young guy at
yes, he is.
Arizona State right now. I want to read you a quote from him. This caught my attention very much here. He says, and this is a quotation from what he said to the AP. For years, it was how I got somebody in the door. Recruiting, okay? And now it's how do I get somebody to stay in the house? And those are two different models. And I think he's exactly right there. And I think coaches like him are figuring this out. It's not just a matter of recruiting anymore, which is the be-all, end-all of the past. It's now a matter of retention, which is a whole different process in many respects, to keep somebody there and not let them be sucked away. So I'd appreciate your reactions, guy. Travis first, possibly, and you also, John and Andrew, about this. How does this really look to you in terms of coaching and managing?
Well, I think from me, and I realize I'm kind of putting my news reporter's hat on this more so than maybe putting myself in the position of a coach, but I think a lot of the at least a piece of an answer to a lot of the questions that we asked today is transparency. I think that when NIL, I mean, we can look back to the 80s and the Pony Express days and say that universities were paying players. They were just doing it under the table and doing it illegally. Well, NIL came around, and there's now avenues where this can be done above board. This can be done in the light of day, but most schools, most programs have, most state legislators have put forth efforts to make sure that these things stay under wraps. If this is different, when I've talked to compliance officials, people in the NIL world, and asked them, like, why does this still need to be so cloak and dagger? And their response was, well, when you know, Travis Kelce signs a new deal with Coke, he doesn't have to disclose what the numbers of that deal are. But my argument back is college sports NIL is vastly different from pro sports or any other industry because there is a competitive balance issue when it comes to NIL. There is how much is a market value for a player, because like you're saying, whether it is recruiting a player or retaining a player on a roster, the NIL deal that they are able to get and sign is kind of their salary. It's what they are being paid to. Well, it's the sweetener that they are being given to stay in the position that they're at or come to your school in the first place. That's the kind of the way this thing has gone. And so I think that more transparency, while players, it probably takes a little bit of the power out of the leverage out of the players' hands. It gives coaches, it gives other players an idea of what is market value for a 3-star commit out of this school. What is the market value for a defensive end that has this many sacks in the SEC or the ACC? And it kind of settles the waves on this, because there's no reason right now for anybody to tell the truth on what numbers are. If you want to, if you're a coach, you're gonna say that all of your players have $1 million contracts because it makes your program look better, and there's no reason to refute that. If you are an athlete, you don't want to say what you're getting because it probably tamps the market value across the board. There's nothing to compare to, really. There's just what you can negotiate and what the school is willing to give you. So I think you kind of control all of this a little bit more if there's a little bit more transparency. I don't know if that is the state legislatures opening up more numbers, more access to these contracts so that the common person or journalist can get to it and publish these, or if it's, I know there's been proposals for like a clearinghouse type situation where all NIL deals over $600 have to be reported to a clearinghouse that can make some of this data publicly available without necessarily naming the player or the individual deal, so that there is a market value set for this situation, because it's not just a free market type argument. It's a competitive balance argument when it comes to what these teams can put on the field. And I think that would help coaches, players, everybody just get a little bit of a control over this thing.
I think you have to have a talent acquisition, a personnel department. You have to recruit your players every day, whether that's 85, soon to be 105 for football, or whether it's 15 for basketball, or the new 24 or 34, however it's going to be for baseball and all your sports. If you are not set up for that, if you are not set up for transfers coming in and going out, as well as recruiting, you've got to know who put his name in, who put her name into the portal immediately. If there hasn't been tampering and she doesn't know where she's already going, a lot of them do, then you have a shot to bring them in to your program. But you've got to recruit your own players every single day, and you better be set up in your athletic department for that. Now, whether that's going to be for your team, I don't know whether that's going to, I think it's going to have to be team by team. I think you're going to have to bring someone in. I can tell you one of the stories that I heard from Omaha. One of the teams the Aggies played had just been eliminated, and one of the transfer players wanted to meet with the head coach the next day on that new campus that he wanted to go to. And that head coach said, "We haven't even left Omaha yet." I'm telling you, 2 years ago, there was someone who wanted to come to Texas A&M and was basically told, we're in the College World Series right now. But those are personalities that you're dealing with. But I think you have to recruit your own team every single day, as opposed to just as it was high school seniors. And then that became high school juniors and then sophomores, right? You had to do that. Now you've got to have your eye on the entire country about who's possibly in that portal, and then who on your team is in charge of getting in touch with that person and possibly bringing them in. It's fascinating. I think you have to have almost, to stay with football, an NFL personnel department has to handle all of that.
Andrew, it's exactly what these coaches interviewed by AP said. They said, we ought to have an NFL model soon enough. Some are already getting there, with a general manager who the coach reports to, between them and the AD. And then there's going to be also this talent acquisition group, or HR, what do you want to call it, which is going to be not only working on recruiting, but also retention of your athletes. It's a full-time job for multiple people to keep track of everything going on in a young man or woman's head and be able to respond quickly to them, to not only get them there, but more importantly, keep them there once they've established themselves as a valuable player. It's going to be a hard job, but more people required.
And that's going to be the separation, Jon, as well, of the haves and the have-nots. You're either going to have that department or you're not going to have it. I mean, I keep talking about this big division Super One. I think if you want to be one of those 50 or 80 teams or whatever number we put on there, I think you're going to have to be set up like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges too is that I just don't know how the collegiate world's going to get here anytime soon, is that the NFL goes to great lengths to try to create rules and regulations around all of these different processes that we're talking about, in the effort to create parity. They don't have recruiting, they have the draft, so based on your one loss pick, you have selection, still got to make good picks, salary caps, all the different things here that I think the college game can get to, but there's still the great, then NIL stands out there as another way where the haves can continue to stretch over the have-nots. And in terms of personnel, again, the haves can create these kind of personnel positions that the have-nots may not be able to be able to create. So how do you manage all of that in the giant scope of things too? And I think that's where it starts to give everybody headaches of trying to, okay, how do we get there? You take one step, you get a little bit closer. Okay, we can create. Okay, there's, let's say call it 22 million. Is what they said for the certain schools that want to play at that level. But that probably doesn't include NIL. That also doesn't include staff coaching sizes. That also doesn't include how many scholarships you're going to give out at the end of the day. So I think all of these things create variables that are going to continue to make this process even more challenging. And going back to the original questions about how do the coaches react to this? I've had a chance to know a lot of coaches over the years, and one thing they'll all tell you when you cut to it, as long as we're all playing by the same rules, give me a chance and I'll tee it up. But in this particular model, I don't know how you even get to the same rules on the whole process. So I think that's going to be a fascinating conversation going forward. But certainly from the administrators who are trying to put rules around, and how the coaches, how the coaches address these issues, both externally and internally.
I've often said this. Fair or unfair. The coaches the field was tilted to their advantage, once it became a level playing field, they're getting out. I don't know. I think it's a combination, but I think we're going to see more of coaches getting out of this industry.
Certainly those who have probably a little bit more experience and come through facing in a world where it was to where the world is headed. So the younger coaches, I think this is going to be the way that it is, and they're not going to know any other way, so they'll adapt and adjust. So again, I think that's a very good point, Andrew.
Well, and you're seeing that wave of coaches at the mid-major level who either realize that they can't compete, and so they're going to take coordinator positions at the Power 5 level, or that they don't want to have to really deal with the overarching umbrella of it all, and they go to a coordinator position because they're not going to be the head coach anymore. There's limited responsibilities with some of that. So I think that is actually going to be a huge wave of more. I mean, we've seen it, not even group of 5 coaches. You had Chip Kelly basically leave UCLA to go be a coordinator because he, in essence, didn't want to have to deal with some of this new wave of stuff, and didn't want to have to be at a program that was kind of trending towards the have-not when it comes to donations. So I think that's going to be another big wave of this as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Loftin, there's another contract you wanted to talk about for a
Yeah,
head
well,
coach.
While Travis is here, let's talk about Schlossnagle a little bit here. They just published a few days ago the terms of his Texas contract. I can't say UT, right? I'll say TU. That's my historic term for them anyway. Basically, the contract he has with Texas has now been revealed. It's interesting in a couple of ways. It's interesting because his first 2 years of salary are $1 million a year, which is less than he made at A&M, quite a bit less, as a matter of fact. I only interpret that to say somehow they're trying to claw back that $2.7 million buyout they had to put forward to be able to get him here from Texas A&M because of the clause in the A&M contract he had, which doubled the amount of the buyout for a in-state school recruiting him. So that's my assumption. It's about the same number. So he's going to go at year 3 to $2.68 million throughout the life of his contract through 2031. It's got the usual bonus ladders in there for, if you're in the championship for the game for the conference, if you win the championship, if you're in the World Series, if you win the World Series, those are bonus numbers right there. But in reality, last year, in the 2024 fiscal year anyway, Schloss made $1.46 million, even though his contract value was somewhat less than that. There's some other things that kicked into that to give him a $1.46 million salary for the last year he spent at Texas A&M. Now he's going down to $1 million at least initially at Texas. I think that there'll be other revenue sources in there, as there always are, from standpoint of sponsorships and appearances and things like that. Those are always part of the deal and hard to quantify. But I'm just curious if you looked at this also, Travis, have you seen any sort of interesting features about these two contracts here? The one at A&M was through 2029. It was ramping up about $500,000 a year from 1.3 to 1.6 at the end of this period of time. The one at Texas is fixed after the first 2 years at 2.68. But of course, all these bonus things make it complicated to know what he actually will make. Any thoughts about that, Travis?
From what I know about Coach Schlossnagle, and I think that this contract kind of actually spells it out a little bit, is the driving factor of his move to go to Texas was simply that he wanted to work with Chris Del Conte again. And I think that this shows a willingness to do what it took to be able to get there. I don't think from what his contract was at TCU, which was not disclosed, private university, to what he made at A&M. I don't necessarily think that the drop in salary to $1 million is going to necessarily hurt him a whole lot for 2 years. I just know from knowing him, from knowing his relationship with Chris Del Conte, from knowing Chris Del Conte, that I think this just kind of plays a little bit more into the fact that the decision was about he wanted to go work at an institution with Chris Del Conte, and especially if that institution is a baseball, historically baseball-rich one like Texas, and the contract can sort itself out, is kind of what it says to me. I'm curious I should have prefaced this whole conversation with my wife does a lot more of balancing the checkbooks around the house than I do. So when it comes to the actual dollar figures, I'm going to leave that to y'all. But from the having conversations standpoint, that's what I know a little bit about the situation as well.
Yeah, understood. Well, I still have to believe there's something else behind the scenes here. I mean, we know the Texas Stadium is not the prettiest stadium in the country, nor is it the largest. It's very small in the SEC world, in fact, as is the one at Texas A&M. So I have to believe that there was a handshake, at least here, about a new stadium or a major redo. I'm not sure they can really expand it much, given where it's located at right now. But I could see ground being broken soon to create a new stadium at Texas, because they want to be able to. They're moving into a baseball conference, the SEC, and with a very small stadium. So I can't see them wanting to stay put with the current stadium they have. And I think that was a major kicker for for Schloss as well here at A&M is the fact that it wasn't a priority at A&M for him to get a new stadium or a major redo of the stadium we have. Any comments about that?
I thought it was interesting as we went around the SEC that he would take a look and say, I really like what Arkansas has in the pro player development, that part of it. I like what Georgia does. I like what Ole Miss does. I like what Mississippi State has. And I'm not saying you have to have a hotel beyond left field. I think there was that fact gathering for what he wants or what he wanted at Olsen Field at Bluebell Park. And I think he can bring that to Texas as well. I know Auburn is doubling its seating. I think it's going to be well over 8,000 now with a new press box. Again, that's also part of the arms race. If we're talking about NIL, schools are going to say, okay, for donors, NIL or facilities. Some may have to choose. Some won't. Some are going to have enough, but that becomes interesting. Back to the haves and have-nots. The haves are going to have the donors, are going to be able to do all that you want to get done with facilities and with NIL. The have-nots are going to have to pick and choose and say, well, we're going to put up with this weight room for now and maybe put it down the line. I just think here we go, because I didn't do it last episode. One of those unintended consequences of how college athletics is going.
Well, I think
Monaco Stadium at Bluebell Park at Olsen Field. I can see it all now, Andrew.
I'm fine with it. I love that, actually. Yeah. You know what? Pitbull be damned.
I think that there's actually a third category kind of coming out of this as well. There's the haves, the have-nots, and well, I'll just call them the fiscally responsible, because there will probably be some universities that have, but choose not to at that moment, at that time, because especially right now, when things are in flux and in these next few years, when they don't really know what fully paying players is going to look like, when they don't really know what all of the new revenue streams they're going to bring in. And so I think, to me, that seems like cross country, there's the haves, there's the ones that and maybe the haves are at times could be the fiscally irresponsible, could be the ones that yeah, we have the money and we can do this, but in 3 or 4 years, that doing that back 3 or 4 years ago, that kind of put us between a rock and a hard place. So I'll be curious to see how many of the schools that are haves become the fiscally responsible, and how many go ahead and continue to spend right now and then put themselves in a tough situation when that, especially 4 years down the settlement, if that's what comes to being, when that revenue increase, when there's percentage increases on the amount of the cap that can be paid players. It's gonna be interesting to me as well.
John, we just wrapped up the Paris 2024 Olympics and changed some topics. You wanted to talk about the viewing habits of these past Olympics.
Well, hopefully all of you watch a little bit of the Olympics. Most of America did. It averaged about 30 million viewers over the course of its 17 days. One of the interesting facts was how NBC tried to parlay the numbers there, was that they had a prime time, which is your traditional prime time, 7 to 10 p.m., and then they launched a new nomenclature called Paris Prime Time, which was basically 1 to 4 in the afternoon. And so that's when most of the live events were on. It was the first time that NBC decided to show those events live versus saving them for tape delay to try to drive that primetime audience, which is usually the most lucrative in terms of forms of advertising. So again, unique strategy, and I think it worked extremely well for them. And I think between those two, that's when you add up both of those two windows, that gets them to the 30 million. And on average, 18 million was in prime time, 12 million was in Paris prime time. So I think those numbers were very, very strong. So I think it was unique how NBC approached it from that standpoint. But also just in terms of consumption, I think one of the interesting things there were a lot of events on Peacock this year, which is their streaming service. And so one of the things I was interested to see is how many people watch Peacock. As someone in the industry, I spent most of my time on the Peacock channel, trying to see. And again, a lot of the obscure sports were on that. But they also had a thing called the Goal Zone, which is like the NFL Red Zone, where you could see a lot of different, particularly people going for medals. They would always, have that teed up, which I think was interesting, like the NFL Red Zone model. But what really caught my eye was how many people ended up watching or consuming or engaging most of the content via Peacock. So out of that 30 million plus on average, Peacock was about 13 million of that, or 13% of that, or 4 million viewers a day from all that, which again continues to show you where the people are going in from streaming. They had 23 billion minutes viewed, which was more than 80% of the last Olympics. And I think, again, what this is just showing you is that today's viewers are getting more and more comfortable with streaming, going through that process. And the big media companies like NBC were able to kind of hopefully look like they did a very good job seamlessly taking those viewers from the NBC broadcast station to the USA cable network to Peacock and back and forth across all their different platforms. So one of the things that I think, again, you will continue to see more and more of this process is, again, the growth of the streaming, area and how people are consuming that. And again, just for the month of July, looking back, is that, in terms of overall viewership in the United States in prime time, 41% of viewership was based off streaming networks. So again, people are getting used to that technology, and I think you're going to see that continue to play a greater role in the upcoming sports media rights negotiations. And if I'm a rights holder, I'm really salivating, because again, as those streamers now get into that world and see the value that it brings to them, they're going to become more aggressive bidders at the next round of the rights negotiations. And the broadcast companies aren't going away either, because again, they need that live content program to anchor their network schedule. So again, I think it just continues to show you the value of live sports when you put great content out there, that there is a marketplace for it. And I think, again, as a rights holder or a conference, commissioner, or even an AD, I do look to the future and see some very, some positive signs based on where we're heading in that world. So despite the talk of, a pullback, or, have we reached the highs? I still think, again, now the streaming universe is starting to step in there. And again, when you look at their market size versus the broadcasters, you're talking about trillions on the streaming side versus billions on the broadcast side. So a lot of opportunity to invest in this content going forward. So I would feel pretty good as a rights holder going forward, and just seeing how these Olympics played out.
Here's how far we've come in 30 years. 1992, Barcelona, the triple cast.
Triple cast, yeah. Wow.
200,000 subscribers. That's all they got. NBC thought they'd get 2 million at the time. 200,000 was the actual total. Now, I know it's a different landscape, but boy, you're right, John. I thought at one point there might be a bubble. Streaming has not popped that bubble. That bubble just keeps getting larger and larger.
And think about the triple cast too. I mean, again, we're going way back for people who follow cable sports, but the challenge for NBC was the only place you could even get the triple cast was you had to have cable. Today, right. Streaming, as long as you have internet, you've got access to virtually everything. So I think that's opened up a great frontier for viewers. Again, you don't have to go behind, there are no barriers to entry. As long as you have an internet, you have access to all of this content.
NBC clearly had a strategy here to use the Olympics as a hook to get people familiar with and into Peacock, with the assumption they're going to continue using it going forward. That to me was very clear throughout this. One thing that also was clear to me is that Jon Heidtke was glued to television for breakdancing.
Me and Snoop Dogg were tight.
He was everywhere, huh? He was everywhere.
The great renaissance of Snoop Dogg.
The one bit they did with him on riding with the Team USA men's basketball team to one of their games on a private train or something, he was asleep on half the ride. So I think that's just, he was actually sleeping during assignments, and then they got him on the air when he was actually awake. But the one thing interesting too with this that I found, we were glued to the Olympics here and we have Peacock and everything, is they didn't put the they only put usually the world streams on Peacock. So if you wanted to, like, for instance, watch gymnastics and hear the cool feature stories they've done on Simone Biles with the American broadcast crew, you had to watch it live or linearly. If you fired it up and tried to replay it on Peacock, it was the world stream with the world's commentators. We ended up actually finding a relative with a good YouTube TV stream who had recorded it to give us their password to go back and watch, because my wife wanted to hear the American commentators for the American gymnastics. So that was an interesting little twist that we started on Peacock, but eventually tried to find the main broadcast feeds when we can on replay, because the world feed, I will say John Anderson on the track world feed was a treat, but the other world feeds just weren't quite as robust as, of course, the main NBC broadcast was.
Precisely, Travis. YouTube TV gives you the ability to record all this stuff. So I recorded all the original stuff with the American commentators, and my wife and I looked at that as we had time over the course of the weeks this went on here. It was really quite convenient for us to do that. We weren't tied to a specific time to watch something then. But you're right. It was interesting how they divided up. And I have to believe they're trying to figure out how to monetize everything about this and going forward, not just for the next Olympics, but also anything else. I mean, after all, we have Winter Olympics coming up pretty soon, but we have other things going on as well. I think Peacock is trying to make a real statement here about we're the future.
So much came out of Stamford, Connecticut for the broadcasters and taking that world feed. LA will be different. You'll be able to have that more. And look, I think the one criticism is always NBC's turned the Olympics in the prime time to America versus the world, as opposed to the Olympic. And if you're old enough, remembering even ABC and how CBS did it. The other thing that people really jumped out at me for those 2 weeks, they missed the days of a clean feed where there's not a ticker and there's not betting odds. There was a score bug and that was it. It was almost jarring because there's been so much that's now on your screen when it comes to that. But I think LA, and then eventually when Salt Lake City has the Winter Olympics coming up, I think you're going to see more of everything that we just talked about. It'll be 4 years now for LA for those Summer Olympics. I think you're going to have broadcasters who are going to be live and not in a studio doing it remotely for the most part. And I think streaming in 4 years, I think the numbers will be incremental. And John, your big thing is then how will NBC use those numbers? I think that's another case of what we'll see between now and the LA Olympics in 28.
Yeah, I think they're going to, set records for how they're going to sell the sponsorships for that. Because I think, again, their viewership metrics, exceeded significantly what they promised the advertising community. So I think going forward in the next 4 years, I think there'll be a lot more with programmatic advertising, dynamic advertising, and these opportunities that they can plug into particularly to the digital feeds on Peacock. I think it'll be fascinating what they do. And the world, I think you'll even see more world sponsors kind of jump in on this process too, because again, how much can Peacock take that feed potentially around the world too? Well, that'll be an interesting conversation as well.
My main goal as an American citizen is just to see how I can push to make sure that we have a team handball team in, because team handball is the greatest Olympic, B-level sport there is out there. I love it. Fun fact, when I was in college, our rec sports director was actually from Italy, and we had team handball rec sport or intramural sports teams, and it was the most fun thing I've ever played. It's fun to watch. I am all in on team handball.
Well, my friends, as we all go to LA together in 4 years, I just want to ask one question. Can you guys push my wheelchair?
Yes, I promise you. Yes. Yeah. Downhill though, down the ramp. I'm not going up the ramp at the Memorial Coliseum.
You'll need one of those motorized ones, I think.
Just a blast. Travis, thanks for spending this episode with us.
Yeah.
Hey, I thought we were going to come in and talk about all of our dynasties on NCAA 25 video game. Y'all got that fired up, right? I just bought my Xbox the other day, so.
Episode 65. That'll be episode 65 next time. Travis, thank you. Dr. Loftin, Jon Heidtke, always good to see you. See you, Kyle Field, in a Saturday or two. How about that?
There you go.
Amen.
Look forward to it. Nick Savage, our producer, thank you very much. Richard Zane for helping out as well. We thank you so much for joining us. This episode of College Sports Follow the Money. Be well, everyone.